Obviously, through this lecture, you can see how cultural and social contexts are important, not just in impacting on a given individual's score on a test, but also on influencing how we develop and construct the test. It's influenced by what we value in terms of the notion of intelligence. So it's important to consider whether a given intelligence test is either valid or appropriate for all people, or do we challenge the assumption of universality. So you can see also that intelligence testing is a more emotionally charged debate than personality testing. Why is this, do you think? Part of the reason may have to do with that intelligence tests have embedded in them the notion that higher intelligence is better. And not only is it better, it's a justification for claiming moral superiority. So if we think about that, how objective could those early intelligence tests be when there was so much subjectivity about the outcome? You can contrast this with personality. As yet, there have been no claims that there's some kind of moral superiority for high extroversion, for example, and personality assessments in and of themselves cannot be used to rigidly influence the life outcomes of many people. Instead, there's a general acceptance that there will be no variation in personality and that this might provide some direction but not judgment for the person's outcome. Having said that, if personality assessment was used to evaluate whether you should get into university, for example, it would only be a matter of time before the topic became controversial. So there's a great debate about the kinds of political influence that bear on the notion of intelligence, and especially the debate about how environments influence IQ scores, that is, how people perform on intelligence tests. Judith Kierans was particularly influential in identifying and attempting to provide alternative explanations for why there may be differences in scores between Anglo-Australian and Aboriginal Australian children. This has continued to raise the question about the impact of culture on both the development of tests and test outcomes. Really, the emphasis here is about the extent to which the tests are validly assessing the underlying construct of intelligence. And if not, how do we construct tests that are valid with a given population? We need to examine the way in which the tests are administered. In addition, the familiarity with the type of test-taking tasks may also be an issue for causing differences in individuals. We need to consider whether the people who take the tests actually see intelligence tests as relevant, or whether the performance is influenced by other factors such as motivation to do well or not do well. How much are they influenced by the test-taking demands of the situation itself? And this brings up the notion of stereotype threat, which is also discussed in your textbook. Overall, it's important to remember that assessment practice, like any psychological practice, and in fact any profession, does not develop in a vacuum. One of the major criticisms of IQ tests is that they rely heavily on verbal ability. Test takers who are not fluent in the native language do poorly on an IQ test, largely because they don't comprehend the test instructions or the questions themselves. The WACE and the Stanford Binet tests draw heavily on the cognitive skills and learning that are needed to succeed in Western education and occupational settings. Western views of intelligence tend to have a strong verbal content and to rely on mathematical and spatial reasoning that may be useful in mathematics or engineering. In contrast, according to Nisbet in 2003, people in Eastern cultures view intelligence as a way for members of a community to recognise contradiction and complexity and to play their social roles successfully. So smart is defined in different cultures differently and require different adaptive behaviours. For example, the Kung tribe in Africa's Kalahari Desert have an almost encyclopedic knowledge of animal behaviour, which is adaptive for a people who must hunt and avoid dangerous animals. Now, there are two main approaches that have been taken to meet the challenges of cross-cultural intelligence assessment. One is to choose reasoning problems that are not tied to the knowledge base of any culture, but that reflect the ability to process and evaluate stimulus patterns. The Raven's progressive matrix has often been used to measure fluid intelligence. As a consequence of this, psychologists have attempted to develop a variety of culture fair tests, which consist of abstract reasoning items that don't depend on language. These tests are presumed to be less influenced by cultural differences than standard IQ tests. As I said before, one of the best known culture fair tests is Raven's progressive matrices, used in the UK as a measure of intelligence. In Raven's progressive matrices, which is a non-verbal task, the examinee needs to pick out the final geometrical pattern in a sequence. The matrices are progressive because they start off easy and become increasingly difficult. Each Raven test has the same format, a 3x3 matrix in which the bottom right entry is missing and must be selected from 8 alternatives. Solving Raven's matrices type problems essentially requires figuring out the underlying rules that explain the progression of shapes. Here's an example to try to figure it out. How did you go with that? The correct answer is 5. The variations of the entries in the rows and columns of this problem can be explained by 3 rules. First, each row contains 3 shapes, a triangle, square, or diamond. Second, each row has 3 bars, black, striped, clear. Third, the orientation of each bar is the same within a row, but varies from row to row, vertical, horizontal, diagonal. From these 3 rules, the answer can be inferred, which was 5. What about this? The correct answer is 3. The number of black squares in each entry increases in the top row from 1 to 2 to 3. Similarly, the number of black squares in the first column decreases from 3 to 2 to 1. What about this figure? The correct answer is 5. Each figure element, horizontal line, vertical line, or V-shape, occurs 2 times in each row. The Raven test has been used in many cultures and measures general mental capacity, and is also measured by traditional intelligence tests in our culture. Scores on the Raven correlate positively with measures of IQ derived from traditional tests, yet they seem to be more culturally fair. A second, more challenging approach is to create measures that are tailored to the kinds of knowledge and skills that are valued in a particular culture. Such tests measure how smart an individual is in terms of the practical skills and adaptive behaviours within that culture. The scores in these types of tests may be unrelated or even negatively correlated with other traditional measures of intelligence, yet they may predict successful functioning within that culture. A question does arise, though. If intelligence is defined as the ability to engage in culture, especially culture-specific adaptive behaviour, then who's to say that the culture-specific measure is not a valid measure of intelligence in that context? So, as a summary, let's think about assessment and its role in society. The goal of psychological assessment is to make as accurate assessments as possible. This is a controversial area for psychology, especially in some areas such as intelligence. 3 ethical concerns are raised. Firstly, the fairness of test-based decisions. Secondly, the utility of tests for evaluating education. And third, the implications of using test scores to categorise people.